Thought turning 30 would be just another birthday. Until I showed up at my parents' house and realized something was terribly wrong. The table was set perfectly, the house eerily quiet, and a single envelope with my name on it. Inside, a message that dredged up secrets I'd buried for decades. That night, I discovered that what looked like a celebration was actually a trap. And what I uncovered changed everything I thought I knew about my family. I arrived at my parents' house that evening feeling a mix of excitement and unease. It was my 30th birthday and I had expected something simple, a quiet dinner, maybe a few laughs, a cake. But the moment I stepped onto the porch, a strange tension settled over me. The lights were on inside, but there was an emptiness to the house that felt wrong, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle, unsure if I should go in. There was a faint smell in the air I couldn't place, a combination of something sweet and something metallic that made my stomach twist. I forced myself to step inside, and the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath my feet somehow sounded foreign. The living room looked normal, perfectly arranged, but the silence was heavy. My parents were nowhere in sight, which struck me as odd. They had usually been bustling about, laughing or scolding, whatever the day called for. I moved toward the dining room, my footsteps echoing, and froze. The table was set for a birthday dinner, plates polished, glasses lined up, candles ready, but it felt staged, too precise, as if it had been prepared for someone else entirely. My eyes drifted to the walls, noticing shadows I had never seen before, stretching and twisting in the soft glow of the overhead lights. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves, but deep down I sensed that something was off, something deliberate, something waiting for me, and that my life as I knew it was about to be quietly, irreversibly unsettled. I moved slowly through the house, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, that my imagination was playing tricks on me. But the more I looked, the more details unsettled me. On the counter there was a vase with fresh flowers I didn't recognize, their petals perfectly open, almost unnaturally so. The chairs around the dining table were aligned with surgical precision, the kind of meticulousness that felt deliberate, almost obsessive. I told myself my parents were just trying to make the night special, but something in the air didn't feel celebratory. I stepped into the living room and my gaze fell on a photograph I hadn't noticed before. It was of me as a child, but someone had scribbled over my eyes with a dark marker. My stomach churned. I knew it wasn't playful or accidental. It carried weight, an unspoken message I couldn't yet interpret. My chest tightened and I realized I was holding my breath without noticing. The house that had once been a sanctuary now felt alien, suffocating in its familiarity. I took a step back and the floorboards creaked underfoot, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet. I wanted to leave, to escape, but something inside me, a mix of curiosity and dread, kept me rooted to the spot. I felt as though the house itself was aware of my presence, aware that I had stumbled onto something that had been hidden for years. Every shadow seemed purposeful, every flicker of light deliberate. I tried to steady my racing thoughts, but I knew deep down that I had crossed a line I couldn't undo, and whatever was waiting for me was about to reveal itself. I finally sat down at the table, my hands hovering over the edges of the polished wood. The plates were pristine, untouched, the silverware gleaming under the soft light. The food smelled familiar but carried a strange undertone I couldn't place, a mixture of spices I didn't remember my parents ever using. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for the envelope that sat squarely in the center of the table, its paper thick and heavy, my name written in my mother's handwriting. I hesitated before picking it up, turning it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it as if it carried more than just words. Finally, I unfolded the paper. Inside, a single sentence waited for me, stark and chilling. "Do you remember what you left behind?" My stomach sank. I racked my memory, searching for some forgotten object, some unresolved errand or unspoken promise. Nothing came to mind, yet the words clawed at something deep within me, something I had tried to ignore for decades. I stared at the paper, tracing the lines with my finger, feeling an odd mixture of dread and curiosity. The envelope seemed almost alive in my hands, a conduit between my present self and a past I had buried. My eyes wandered back to the table, to the perfectly aligned plates and glasses, and suddenly everything seemed calculated, deliberate. This wasn't just a birthday dinner. The realization settled like a stone in my chest. Someone wanted me to confront something, to remember something I had deliberately forgotten. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, pressing against my skin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the night ahead would unravel more than just memories. I wasn't ready, yet somehow I knew I had no choice. I left the dining room, my hands still trembling slightly from the envelope's message, and wandered down the hallway. Every step felt louder than it should, echoing off the walls like the house was amplifying my unease. I glanced at the family portraits lining the hall, faces I had known my entire life staring back at me. Yet for the first time they didn't feel familiar. Something about the angles, the expressions, even the lighting seemed off, as if the photos had been subtly altered to convey a story I wasn't meant to see. My gaze landed on my old bedroom door, slightly ajar. I hadn't been inside for years, not since I moved out in a rush during some forgotten fight. A mix of nostalgia and dread made me hesitate before pushing it open. The scent hit me first. A mix of the old carpet, faint lavender, and something sharper, metallic almost, that made my stomach churn. I stepped inside and froze. The room was a time capsule. Posters I had plastered on the walls, books stacked neatly on shelves, my desk arranged in ways I didn't remember. And then I saw it. Items I had thought lost forever. Letters from my teenage years, small drawings, even a journal I had misplaced in a fit of anger after a family argument. I picked up the journal, its pages brittle, yellowed with age. As I opened it, memories I had long since suppressed rose to the surface. Moments of humiliation, betrayals I had ignored, and feelings I had convinced myself didn't matter. The realization hit me slowly, like a tide creeping over my feet. This night wasn't about celebrating me. It was about forcing me to confront the parts of my past I had tried to bury. I returned to the dining room with the journal clutched in my hands, my thoughts spinning faster than I could process. The table, the flowers, the perfectly aligned plates. All of it had a new weight now, as if the room itself were a stage and I had just uncovered the script. Every detail suddenly seemed purposeful. I could no longer see this as a simple birthday celebration. My parents weren't celebrating me. They were orchestrating something I was only beginning to understand. I sat down again, trying to steady my breathing, but my mind kept replaying memories I had shoved aside for years. Times when I had been humiliated, dismissed, or subtly punished for things I hadn't even realized mattered. Each recollection was like a small pinprick, painful but precise, reminding me of how much had been ignored, both by them and by myself. I began noticing small manipulations in the room, objects placed just so, the way shadows fell across the walls, the way my parents moved in and out of the kitchen with quiet, deliberate pauses. Every movement, every placement seemed designed to provoke, to test, to remind me of what I had overlooked in my own life. Anger began to rise inside me, but it was controlled, sharp, and focused. This wasn't a moment for outbursts or confrontation. It was a moment for observation, for understanding, for planning a response that mattered. I realized that the night had been constructed to unsettle me, to make me see patterns and truths I had refused to acknowledge. I felt the slow shift inside myself, a quiet determination forming. I wasn't powerless here, and I would find a way to reclaim the narrative no matter how long it took. As the evening wore on, I began noticing the subtle changes in my parents' behavior. They moved deliberately, slowly, their eyes flicking toward me and then away, as if communicating silently in a language I didn't know. Their smiles felt measured, almost rehearsed, and every gesture seemed calculated to evoke a reaction without saying anything outright. I tried to carry on small talk, keeping my voice steady, but it felt hollow, like we were all actors in a play whose script I hadn't been given. I realized that nothing around me was random. The placement of objects, the timing of movements, even the way the light fell through the windows seemed intentional. It was as if the house itself had become a trap, guiding me toward revelations I wasn't prepared for. I could feel a growing tension pressing against me, a sense that at any moment, a hidden truth would be laid bare, and there was nothing I could do to avoid it. My pulse quickened, but outwardly I maintained composure, studying everything carefully. I began to recognize patterns in their behavior, tiny shifts that hinted at intentions and motives I hadn't considered. Each observation made me simultaneously fearful and strangely empowered. I was beginning to see the invisible architecture of their control. I realized the night wasn't about celebration or family warmth. It was about confrontation, subtle and slow, meant to test my awareness, my patience, my understanding. The more I paid attention, the more I saw how much had been orchestrated without my knowledge, and I began to wonder if this was just the beginning of something far larger than a birthday dinner. The house felt alive and I was its captive audience, forced to watch and think, and to plan my own quiet response. I couldn't stop thinking about the patterns I'd noticed, so I started searching the house more deliberately. That's when I found the locked drawer in the kitchen, tucked neatly beneath the counter as if it had been waiting for someone like me to discover it. My hands hovered over the handle, hesitant, but curiosity overpowered caution. I forced it open, and inside were letters from my teenage years, letters I had written to friends, crushes, even teachers, things I never sent, thoughts I had kept private. The handwriting was young, naive, raw, and reading it now made my chest tighten. These weren't just memories. They were confessions, pieces of me I had trusted to remain hidden. But someone had kept them, organized them, and preserved them like evidence. I realized with a cold clarity that my parents had been silently reconstructing my life, cataloging it in ways I hadn't imagined. The weight of betrayal pressed down on me. I felt exposed, violated in a way that wasn't physical but deeply psychological. And yet, alongside the anger, a strange sense of clarity emerged. I wasn't powerless. I could observe, understand, and respond. I spent hours sifting through the letters, tracing my own voice across the margins, reliving moments I had tried to forget. Each page I turned felt like a step deeper into a maze I hadn't realized I was in. By the time I returned to the dining room, I understood that the night had a purpose far beyond celebration. It was a reckoning, a confrontation with everything I had ignored, overlooked, or dismissed. And somewhere in me, a quiet plan began to take shape, not impulsive or reckless but careful, deliberate, and measured. I spent the next few hours wandering through the house, the journal and letters in my hands like a map of my own past. Every item I touched seemed to carry a message, a hidden meaning I hadn't noticed before. Old photographs, childhood toys, even books I had long forgotten. They all felt like pieces of a puzzle I was only just beginning to assemble. The more I examined, the more I realized how carefully everything had been curated. My parents weren't just preserving memories. They were shaping a narrative, one that cast me in a certain light without my knowledge or consent. I felt a strange mix of anger, fear, and fascination. Part of me wanted to scream, to confront them immediately, but another part knew that would play right into their hands. Instead, I began documenting everything myself, taking mental notes, tracing patterns, photographing details with my phone. Each observation was a small reclaiming of control, a way to assert that I wasn't entirely a pawn in their game. By the time I returned to the dining room, my outward composure had returned, but inside my mind was racing. I felt sharper, more aware, acutely tuned to every nuance in the room. The careful placement of objects, the timing of movements, the silence punctuated by small sounds, all of it was data I could use. For the first time that night, I felt like I had regained some measure of power, subtle and invisible but real. I didn't yet know how I would act on it, but I knew I couldn't leave the house the same person I had entered as. Something had shifted inside me, quietly but irrevocably. By late evening, the tension in the house had become almost unbearable. My parents moved through the rooms with quiet precision, their expressions calm but unreadable, as if every gesture was calculated to keep me guessing. I watched them closely, noticing how they exchanged subtle glances and shifted their positions in ways that suggested unspoken communication. It was clear now that the entire night had been orchestrated, a carefully constructed test designed to unsettle me and force me to confront things I had long avoided. I could feel the weight of their attention, even when they weren't looking directly at me, and it made every step I took feel heavy, deliberate. I realized I had a choice. I could react emotionally, give in to anger or fear, and become part of the game they had set up, or I could respond with quiet calculation, observing and leaving subtle traces of my own awareness. I chose the latter. I began to leave small, almost imperceptible hints that I had noticed everything. The photographs slightly repositioned, objects handled in ways that suggested careful attention, tiny signs that I understood their manipulations. I watched their reactions, noting the slight tension in their shoulders, the pauses that hadn't been there before. The dynamic of the evening shifted almost imperceptibly. The control I had felt slipping earlier was slowly returning to me. I didn't need to confront them openly, or make my presence known aggressively. Instead, I allowed the tension to build quietly, letting them sense that the balance of power had changed. By the end of the night, a subtle psychological shift had occurred, one that left me with a quiet satisfaction, though the larger reckoning had only just begun. As the night drew to a close, I pretended to be tired, giving myself an excuse to retreat to my old bedroom. Alone with the door closed behind me, I finally allowed myself to breathe and reflect on everything I had uncovered. The letters, the journal, the perfectly orchestrated dining room, and the subtle manipulations, they all pressed on me with a weight I hadn't anticipated. I sat on the edge of my bed, tracing the edges of the journal in my hands, feeling the brittle pages and the words that had once seemed insignificant now revealing a larger truth. My parents' quiet orchestration wasn't about punishment or malice, not entirely. It was about control, about shaping a narrative I hadn't realized they were invested in. I understood now that this night wasn't about celebration. It was about forcing me to see, to confront, to reckon with my own past and their version of it. I began writing notes to myself, documenting everything, analyzing every subtle movement, every calculated pause I had observed. It felt almost ritualistic, a way to reclaim some sense of order and clarity. For the first time that evening, I felt a measure of control. I wasn't powerless. I could observe, interpret, and prepare for what might come next. And yet there was an unease I couldn't shake. The house, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a living entity watching, waiting. I knew the reckoning wasn't over, that the quiet shifts I had set in motion might have consequences I hadn't anticipated. But for the first time I felt ready, not to confront them directly, but to understand, to respond, and to navigate a story that had long been written without my consent. The next morning, I left the house quietly, carrying only my thoughts and the faint weight of the journal under my arm. The driveway felt longer than usual, the air heavy with the remnants of the night's tension. The table had been cleared, the flowers removed, and yet the silence of the house lingered, thick and unsettling, as if it had absorbed everything that had happened. I drove slowly, replaying each moment in my mind, the letters, the subtle gestures, the hidden messages in the photographs and objects. It was clear that my parents had been orchestrating more than a birthday dinner. They had been testing me, probing my reactions, and asserting their control in ways I hadn't anticipated. But the quiet satisfaction I felt was not the satisfaction of revenge or triumph. It was something quieter, almost imperceptible. I had reclaimed a measure of control simply by observing, documenting, and understanding what had been laid out for me. I hadn't shouted, confronted, or made my presence explicitly known. My response had been deliberate, subtle, and invisible. Yet even as I felt this small victory, a creeping unease followed me. I wondered if they had sensed the shift, if they realized that the balance had changed, even without words being exchanged. I also questioned myself, wondering if I had read too much into their actions or created patterns where none truly existed. And still, the house and the events of that night lingered in my mind, an unresolved weight pressing against my thoughts. Something fundamental had shifted between us, a quiet reckoning that had altered the dynamic forever, leaving me alert, aware, and uncertain of what would come next. I keep thinking about that night, even weeks later, and the memories refuse to settle. The house, the letters, the careful manipulations, they follow me in quiet moments, whispering questions I can't answer. I feel like I've reclaimed something, a measure of control over my own story, but it comes with a cost. I am more aware now, more cautious, and yet there's an unease that sits beneath everything, a constant reminder that the past never truly disappears. I didn't yell, I didn't confront, and I certainly didn't react in a way that would make the evening dramatic. Instead, I observed, documented, and allowed the night to unfold in its own quiet way, letting the reckoning speak for itself. Sometimes I wonder if I overanalyzed everything, if I imagined patterns that weren't there, but other times I remember the subtle shifts in their expressions, the precise placement of objects, and the timing of every gesture, and I know I didn't. I can feel that night still shaping me, a quiet echo of tension and awareness that lingers long after the house has been left behind. The letters and the journal, the photographs and the small hints I left behind, they all sit in my mind like a web I can't quite untangle. I don't know if my parents will ever understand the quiet reckoning that took place, or if I'll ever be able to look at them the same way again. The story remains unresolved, a slow-burning tension that has changed the way I see my family, and in some ways myself. Some victories are silent, some reckonings are incomplete, and some stories are meant to linger, echoing in the corners of your mind long after the lights go out.